So hi, welcome back to the next chapter in our OPA and Siebel IP16 webinar. So now we're kind of into the most important part of the course. Specifically, this is where we're going to talk about the different methods and implementing each of them, whether they be for metadata or for data. Before we do that, this short module is kind of an overview of some of the other things I think that you will need to know about if you're confronted with this kind of integration. So we're going to talk about the prerequisites, that's an obvious. We're also going to talk about the contents of the white paper, the files that you get, and some of the things you're going to need to do to adapt those files to make them work. Before then, we go into, in detail, each of the metadata and data methods. So the prerequisite is that you have an environment ready to go, your WebLogic is started and your OPA managed server is started. On the other side, you need Siebel 16, and just so you know, the image that you're going to be seeing in some of the demos was actually 16.0000 unpatched. So in theory, if you're on a later version, it should work as well. In these demos, we don't use workspaces, although they were an option in Siebel 16. So you might need to adjust some of the process of delivering the SRF if you're using workspaces, but that shouldn't be rocket science for you. And for speed purposes, on all of the videos, we don't go through the checkout, making changes, checking in, and all that. So essentially, we're making changes on the server as well for speed. You will need an object manager. In this class, we'll be using an English ENU object manager, but you can use others. And the zip file that you're going to need for all of this is referenced right there, and it's on the Oracle OPA blog as well. So a little bit of background. The white paper was introduced because in the IP15, the integration with OPA was successful, but it had some limitations. And those limitations meant that customers needed an alternative solution to implement OPA with Siebel 16. And hey presto, that's, I think, why the white paper now exists. Here's a kind of brief overview of the differences between the integration on 15 and 16. I think that you can read through this slide, as much as you like, but the fundamental difference is as follows. One, IP15 used OpenUI. What I mean is the renderer for the visual aspect, so the renderer of the web pages was an OpenUI renderer. In Siebel 16, we're actually using native OPA rendering because OPA natively creates interviews which are based on HTML5 and JavaScript. So in IP15, we leveraged OpenUI, and IP16, we leverage OPA. And the difference for that is that twofold, I think. One, it means that everything you now do in OPA will be visible in Siebel, whereas in IP15 there were some limitations. For example, in OPA we can do some very clever dynamic screen manipulation. We can show and hide things without writing a single scrap of JavaScript. And that really didn't work in IP15 because the renderer rendered an initial layout and then didn't do any more rendering. It didn't do any dynamic updating. Another good example would be OPA doesn't have a one-to-one match in terms of the controls we use. A text box control or a date control, they're fine. But in OPA, we have signature controls as standard, we have file uploads as standard, we have containers as standard, we have a whole bunch of other controls that simply don't map easily to something in Siebel. So in IP15, there were things that were left behind in OPA. Going back a little bit further in the sort of history of Siebel and OPA, just to clarify, is that if you are talking to a customer who's using OPA 10, they're using a completely different architecture to anybody who's using OPA 12, if they're integrating with Siebel, I mean. In OPA 10, the integration with Siebel was a very old-fashioned and standard approach. It was a custom-built connector, which basically meant a bunch of DLLs, some business services, and some workflows and screens and applets and what have you. that were built right into Siebel. And then in OPA 12, the integration changed for good because it became more generic. The same connection architecture can be used for Siebel or for Service Cloud or for SAP or for Microsoft Dynamics or whatever. So that was good. And there's a summary of the main differences between the integration styles 15 and 16. I think really what is important for us today is to look, and you'll see the last point on each of them is workflows and web services load and save data. And it's the same in both cases. So you're going to be working with things that you know quite well already. So when you download that zip file, there's a whole bunch of files and folders in there. But there's one major CIF file which appears to contain everything you need, and its name is up on the screen right now. So you need to import that in. It does include integration objects and workflow processes, as well as I think, if my memory serves me rightly, some other stuff as well. But right now, what you're interested in is the workflow processes and integration objects. You'll need to compile, release to the server, and you will need to publish and activate if you're experimenting with the demonstration workflows and the demonstration web services. You would publish and activate each of these workflows. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to publish and activate those workflows, but we're going to make changes to them. And we're also going to use those workflows in inbound web service definitions. You'll also find in the zip file some XSL files. So we do a little bit of cleaning up of the request and response that comes in from OPA and goes back to OPA using XSLT. Be aware that a lot of the time the workflows and other things expect those files to be in the temp folder as well as being in the XSLT folder on the Siebel server. Obviously, if you're going to test this, you're going to need at least one OPA deployed policy model. The last point is what I referenced a minute ago, is that ultimately what you're trying to build is a web service definition with essentially, what you're trying to build is a web service definition with essentially one service per method or per workflow, if you like. So if you're going to go straight in and try the generic one, that's the file, we're going to build that web service bit by bit in this class, because obviously each time you do it, it's going to be slightly different. So a little bit about the inbound web service. If you do choose to import it, you probably already know that when you import a web service or when you build a web service, the web service when you import a web service, the service ports that are imported as well, if you delete the parent web service, the service ports remain in the database. So if you try and import it again, you get a message like the one I'm showing you on the right-hand side of this slide that says, I can't because the service ports are still there. I'm sure you've seen this before, so just think carefully about removing those service ports before you remove the inbound web service. Otherwise, you'll get into this trap of trying to import it twice and getting a constraint error. So, enough about the big enough about the big picture. Let's dig down into what it is we're trying to implement. To implement an integration between OPA and Siebel, you need two different sets of methods. You need what I call design time methods and execution methods. The design time, or the metadata methods, these methods, they do a very important job. They share metadata between Siebel and OPM. Siebel, and they share metadata between Siebel and the Oracle Policy Modeler, so the design time tool. Basically, if you're an OPA designer, you need to have information about Siebel metadata when you're building your rules. Because if you're going to talk about, I don't know, a contact first name and a contact last name, that metadata has to be accessible to you. There are actually two metadata methods. The first one is really simple. The first one is called check alive. I call it the ping. It's used in various places to check whether the connection is alive. It's a completely generic request and response. What I mean is if you import the workflow that is provided in the zip, you'll probably never need to modify it because it's a simple request and response with a single XML tag in the response. Where can you see it being used? Well, you can see it being used on the OPA side if you're looking at information about the connections that are live in your OPA environment. So you can see a little green check mark down there. That is a live Siebel connection. By far the most important metadata method is this one, get metadata. Basically, as you can see on my screenshot here, and obviously we'll go into more detail later, when you're a designer of a rule in OPM, you need to have access to information about the Siebel connection. Each Siebel connection represents essentially one integration object, one business object. So it's quite likely that as a designer, when I go and look at my connections, there might be 5 or 10 or 20 of them displayed here. So I need to be able to select this connection, and I need to be able to then see the metadata that's associated with it. And when I've chosen the right one, I then want to use that in my rules. I want to reference Siebel data in my rules. So up comes now one of our first videos. So this video that you're going to see in just a moment is all about how to implement the check alive and get metadata. Specifically, you will make sure that the workflows are imported. You will create the initial inbound web service. You will also then generate the WSDL and test the basic principle using SOAP UI. You probably will notice that we talk about editing the workflow processes, specifically in the second case, get metadata, since you're getting an integration object. So if you have multiple integration objects, you need to make sure that each workflow references the right one. We'll also talk about troubleshooting. There's bound to be a few things that'll catch you out the first few times. You don't have to watch that video now. In fact, you could probably come back to the video after the end of this presentation. So onwards to the data methods. The data methods are those that are used at execution time, or at runtime if you prefer. They are the ones that will be responsible, for example, for loading data from Siebel into OPA, so that the user, for example, it says, what is your first name? And it's already populated because the data has come from Siebel. 2, submitting the data back. So when the interview is finished, maybe we've calculated, I don't know, the amount of your benefits, or we've calculated how much money you should pay in a speeding fine, whatever it is, we then need to submit something back to OPA, and submit something back necessarily perhaps to Siebel. And we'll talk about the other data methods as well, and there are 4 in total. The most common, of course, and the minimum set of instructions that you need to give are load and submit. Load lets an OPA interview call Siebel. So let's say you have an interview that asks people their names and their age and their circumstances, and then calculates how much benefits they should receive. So the load will go off to Siebel, and provided we have something useful like a row ID, we will query Siebel and bring back data. That data will be displayed in the interview. As you can notice in the first point, there'll be some reformatting because, well, guess what? OPA doesn't talk integration objects, it talks about something else. It has its own abstraction layer. Notice the first bullet point. It says inbound mapped load at start. This is terminology you'll see a lot in OPA, is that when we talk about loading data, we will talk typically about load at start and inbound mapped. Let's say that I have the first name that is in Siebel and I want it to appear in OPA from the start. Guess what? That's called inbound mapped load at start. Not difficult. At the end of the interview, I click a button in OPA that says submit, which basically says I've finished. And that means that data is going to go back to Siebel, and this data is outbound mapped in OPA. So it's out from OPA back to Siebel. Once you've done that, there may be a final step. Maybe as well as sending stuff back to Siebel, you also want something to be displayed in the interview to say, yes, we've successfully updated your data in Siebel. A kind of final goodbye, if you will. This is an inbound map, load after submit. So maybe, just an example, you're going to update the benefit field in Siebel, and then you are going to refresh the last page of OPA and show the benefit amount. So it's going to be an inbound load after submit. So it's almost a confirmation that something has been done. Guess what? They're both web services, and they are therefore testable in SOAP UI, but if you use the default request, you're going to need a considerable amount of modification. I'm happy to provide examples, although once you get the hang of it by watching the videos, you'll find it very straightforward. Perhaps the biggest thing to remember is that each of these will need your SOAP header in the request header, to be adjusted so that you have the username and password. And most of the items are optional, so you'll need to do a lot of removals before they'll work. Otherwise, you just get errors about question marks. So we talked a moment ago about loading data, and that's fairly straightforward. The submit part is somewhat challenging when you first work with it. Let me explain why. It's because there are essentially two things you need to think about. One, this is a request from OPA to get Siebel data. Then we load the Siebel data and then we respond. Okay, so at the beginning of the interview, it's a load. Now what we're doing is we're saying, okay, OPA has finished. OPA sends the submit request to Siebel, and then Siebel needs to provide the response back to OPA to say, yes, thank you, I have received your update, I'm good to go. Notice the three small bullet points. When Siebel responds to OPA, it's essentially sending back a set of information which may update something in OPA. This was the example I gave you a moment ago where I said that sometimes at the end of the process, once you've updated something in Siebel, you may want to send a message back to OPA. It's called a load after submit, to say, hey, we're finished and here's the amount of benefit that's been added in Siebel. Or we may be, as in my case, we'll simply display a message maybe that says, thank you, your data has been updated in Siebel. So Siebel has to correctly formulate the response. Notice the second bullet point. This load after submit sends a message back to OPA. It doesn't update Siebel. Siebel receives a bunch of XML as a request and responds with a bunch of XML to OPA. You will need to think about what happens between those two. You will need to think about, okay, I need to take what I've received from OPA and I need to perhaps update Siebel in some way. In the standard workflow, there is no updating of Siebel, even though it's called submit, because technically speaking, it's a request from OPA and a response from Siebel, and there doesn't actually need to be any updating in Siebel at all, even though logically that's what would happen. So you need to think about, when you're thinking of this as a workflow, your workflow needs to deal with the request response mechanism, plus you will need to think about the request you've received from OPA, which contains the benefit amount or whatever it is. What are you going to do with it? Probably going to update Siebel, right? So when we talk about submit, we talk about the first and the second part. The first part is just handling the request and the response, as you would any other inbound workflow. The second part is, what do I do with the data I've received from OPA? So in the example workflow that comes in the zip, the answer is nothing actually happens. There's a static value appended to the active record in Siebel. So it doesn't update any particular field. It just puts a text message in a field to say Siebel has successfully answered the submit request with a submit response. You will need to think about how to edit this submit workflow so that you can update Siebel properly. Otherwise, this workflow is not really that useful. In the video, you'll also see some suggestions about how you're going to need to perhaps adapt the workflow moving forward. Let's summarize it. In the submit workflow, and therefore the submit inbound workflow inbound workflow method, you're going to have to handle a request coming in from OPA, which contains data you probably want to save into Siebel. You'll need to save that data into Siebel and then respond to OPA to say, I've saved it in Siebel, thank you very much, end of story. Also in video form coming up shortly, and we'll deal with these in more detail. Incidentally, we'll deal with each of these methods in more detail, is set checkpoint and get checkpoint. These are not required for the majority of prototypes. You could get up and running just with check alive, get metadata, load and submit. However, these can be incredibly useful. What are they? They are snapshots. Take a snapshot of an OPA interview before it's finished, and then allow people to recover that and carry on. It's a little bit like Siebel Task UI if you think of the idea of pausing and resuming. Neither of those are implemented in the zip file correctly, so you need to do some extra work, as we'll see. Now, for now though, I suggest that you watch the videos for Check Alive and Get Metadata, that you find out about the troubleshooting methods that I would recommend, and you test it basically. Before you go into the videos, some really basic stuff now. A lot of the workflow processes will talk about C:\temp. If you've decided to put it in a different folder, go around all of the workflow processes, checking for a process property or an argument value that is ctemp. A couple of the workflows have default row IDs in their process properties because someone was probably testing them. It doesn't really matter, but it just remember to remove them. And then the bullet point underneath is that the submit workflow process is going to need to have some additional steps added and quite probably some steps removed, which we'll talk about in the video. And the final point is an important one. One of the things that you imported, the final point is a really important one. Most of these web service methods use filter services. So when you build the inbound web service, you will notice that there's a place for you to enter a request filter and a response filter. Make sure you don't forget those. I highlighted in the video. If you do forget it, you'll find that when you test your WSDL in SOAP UI, you get a bunch of extra tags that shouldn't be there. That's the job of the filter services, is to get rid of those extra tags. Given that these web services talk about integration objects and components and so on, I'm assuming you've compiled them, and if you're using the integration object deploy, when you can right-click in Siebel tools, that you've deployed the integration object. And necessarily, as you'll see in some of the videos, if we've added business components, check that we haven't added any tables, and if you have, sync the schema before going any further. All right.